Now before, when it was like we're going to avoid certain investments, now it's more of where is it that we're going to invest in? We're going to invest in transition. Now that's a big change, and I think. And you've seen today in some of the signings and MOUs, we've already seen that there's a lot of capital in place at the moment, right? That's actually looking for investments. So that's a big change. That's good. But I think there's still a lot more to be done. And let me explain to you where, while I think there's a big inflection point, there's still a lot more that we can do. And this is the stage where we truly believe that, whether it's climate change, sustainability is the way to go. In other words, it's our lifestyle in the future. And we start thinking of imagining the future and looking back, this is where we get innovation coming in. I don't think we're there yet. We haven't seen a lot of innovation in the country. Risk capital is on the low side, so that's still to be done. So yes, you asked me this way, the landscape has changed tremendously. We see a lot of capital, but there's still more to go. Yeah.
Thank you, Datuk. Thanks for sharing your view and highlighting the fact that we are at an inflection point and that shift is really happening. Maybe Rick, you can sort of add on to that, right? Since PNB is one of the largest fund management companies in Malaysia that has committed to invest 10 billion ringgit in green and transition assets by 2030, what do you see as opportunities in Malaysian companies that are taking up this challenge to be more sustainable and ready for investments in green areas?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the question. Before I answer specifically where the opportunities are, maybe to frame it, first is that energy transition or path to sustainability is a large mega trend. And every institutional investor I speak to, and most large companies, are thinking actively how to transform that portfolio today and also how to take advantage of this opportunity. Secondly, capital is global. So while we have ideas and plans, we need to be very compelling and have the right policy framework and the right environment in order to attract capital. So for example, the US had the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, they had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, they had the CHIPS Act. All of that created an environment where investors felt compelled to invest into those sectors in the US. But more importantly, you need the implementation to come as well. So if you look at where the capital is being deployed into the US, it is in states where regulation is a bit more easier, the red states. A lot of the money is going to Texas and so on. Now, if I then reflect on Malaysia, I think we have right now a very permissive policy framework and plans that support investment into the country. So as we know, Malaysia has committed to net zero by 2050 at the earliest. More importantly, we have committed to reducing emissions by 45% by 2030 based on a 2005 baseline. If you then translate that into what specific opportunities out there to deliver on that, it is something like 50 gigawatt of solar. It is 2.5 million tons of hydrogen. It is 100 waste to energy plants. It's 5 million electric vehicles, which is about 1 in 3 vehicles by 2050 will be electric, and so on. So the opportunities are immense, but I would say that as important as the policy and the plans, we need to have the right implementation framework to get us there. So for PNB, how are we thinking about investing behind this opportunity? Firstly, we see a lot of opportunity just because of the portfolio we have. 80% of our portfolio is in Malaysia, and we own, for example, 10% of the stock market. So when we say we're going to invest behind energy transition, it's actually investing behind the companies that we have and helping them on this path to decarbonization and being a lot more sustainable. So everywhere we look, there are opportunities because we need to stay invested to helping our portfolio companies be on this path to decarbonization, because we baseline our emissions. 10 companies account for close to 90% of our emissions. So we need to work through those companies, help them get to a path of sustainability in order for them to have a more robust business model. Secondly, in terms of new dollars, so the 10 billion ringgit, some people get excited about it, some people get a bit underwhelmed because we are a 330 billion fund. The point was not so much, is it too big or too large? It's just a marker for us to mobilize the organization to say, okay, let's now find these opportunities, whether it's in public markets, whether it's in infrastructure, private equity, and so on, to invest behind it. So we now have an aligned taxonomy internally in terms of what qualifies, and in terms of the principles, in terms of what we're looking for things that will make a true change in terms of mitigation and adaptation. We're looking at things that will help with biodiversity, marine conservation, and so on. But more importantly, given our stance, investment stance, we want things that are a bit more mature in terms of the maturity spectrum, and we want things that are aligned to issues we're trying to solve in our portfolio, and we are looking for things that will help Malaysia on its path to decarbonization. So ultimately, we are, based on that, 4 sectors stand out for us: transport, power, OFLU, which is agriculture, forestry, and less land use change, and also green buildings. So for examples of opportunities that fall within this set is renewable power, green mobility, green buildings, sustainable fuels, nature-based solutions, and so on. So the universe is vast, and our playing field is not just domestic. We also look at things internationally. So there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of opportunities based on what government has announced, based on what the requirements in our portfolio, and based on what we've stated we want to try to achieve.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for highlighting that in a lot of detail. I think, Haniza, Rick highlighted the point that putting in place the right regulations to enable companies, portfolio companies, to be able to shift is also really important as well. From a regulation and development perspective, could you share a little bit about what Malaysia has done and perhaps what Malaysia is still looking to do to help to encourage more ESG investments?
Okay, thank you, Nolin, for the opportunity to share what a regulator does, because it's kind of hard to come in here and speak between the industry persons and then say what we do, because sometimes what we do might seem very, very structured, and I think this is where we worry. They all talk about very exciting things. Then you have this flavor from the SC Malaysia that talks about, what we do, what we don't allow to be done. But anyway, I'm going to try and answer that question as best as I can. I think for SC, we have been committed and aligned to that agenda and sustainable development. And we recognize as a regulator, we hold a dual role. We not only regulate, we also develop as a regulator. And that's where we recognize that for interventions to happen, I think the intermediation or whatever initiatives we do have to be in line with what investor demands are, but what also are the needs for investment and financing needs to generate. And I think the perspective I also want to add today here is Malaysia has always been one of the leaders in Islamic finance. And honestly, I think we started our journey on the sustainability path way back in 2014, actually, when we came up with the SRI Sukuk framework. So whether or not it was ahead of the curve, but the recognition for sustainable, responsible investment was really because Islamic finance and sustainability has a lot of commonalities. The commonalities in trying to do justice, the humane part, I think the whether to balance the profit and planet needs, but I think it was always inherent in the values of Islamic finance. So in addressing that unique convergence, I think we have been able to actually introduce several regulatory initiatives to actually grow the ecosystem. And that's why I think we actually were able to leverage on the robust ecosystem of the Sharia and the Islamic capital market to actually come up with, well, we still, I think today say it's a groundbreaking SRI Sukuk framework, because I think that recognition of the various asset classes that can lead to the good of the universe has been inherent and has been built in since 2014. And if, just to share with you the size, that actually today, sustainable and responsible sukuk issuances in Malaysia is about 18 billion ringgit, close to about $4+ billion US. And we grew from an issuance of about 10 in 2014. We now have more than 20. About close to half of it is in energy, in renewable, and the balance in actually social, the S factor of the ESG. So that journey, I think the last 15 years or so has been very robust. And I think if you look at the opportunities, the two traditional asset classes, basically sukuk and equities, do realize that in Malaysia, equities, Sharia compliant equities make up close to 80% of the market. So for a fund manager to do an ESG-aligned portfolio, the traditional assets you're already able to. It's just a matter of what filters you choose to take. And that's why I think when the topic was given about ESG investing, it was kind of easy for the Islamic finance and Islamic capital market to speak about it. And if we use that context setting, which I kind of shared just now, I think to answer you what Malaysia has done from a regulatory perspective, our first intent was how does one accelerate sustainable investment? And that recognition way back, we realized that you need to make the range of investable universe wide enough for investors to be able to be active in it. But bear in mind, we not only develop, we regulate. So whatever interventions we come in must also bear in mind investor protection. So transparency, disclosure, etc., is at the top of our priorities. So when we issued our second strategic document, the Capital Market Master Plan 2, one of our strategies identified was how does one promote socially responsible financing and investment. And it was kind of easy to do that because we already had introduced the SRI Sukuk framework in 2014. We then had a lot of first in Malaysia, actually. Maybe not everyone recognizes, but since 2014, Malaysia had the first social sukuk in 2015. Khazanah played a significant role in that. We had the first green sukuk in 2017 with World Bank, actually. And since then, we've had a lot of several issuances that's gone to green building, hydropower, water treatment. So I think as an enabler, a facilitator, that step has been taken by the regulator, but we also continuously follow that through. Just again to share what a regulator does, because we don't often get to shout out what we do. You know, it's usually consequential. I mean, the industry takes it up, and that's where we're happy. Our report card is when industries can translate that into outcomes, because it's always outcome-based. So when we saw the journey of the SRI Sukuk, we then realized a roadmap would be useful to actually help the players or the actors in this field. And that meant that we needed to give a push for widening the range of SRI instruments. We launched an SRI fund framework. We also saw the need for SRI investor base to be expanded. We recognized that there was a governance culture that needed to be put in place. So our MCCG actually included that for board capacity building, for industry capacity building. We also saw how important it was for information architecture to be made available. So these were recognitions that had already been put out, and we were working with the industry on how to do this. But given then the need to actually translate and push for brown to go green, we also put out an SRI-linked Sukuk framework. And that was actually in 2022, where we try and make it easy and more flexible for companies to transition and achieve the net zero, where utilization of proceeds were not defined. You could actually do it, but with a commitment. And that meant we were hand-holding companies taking that journey. So that helped. But at the same time, I think we also realized, being the regulator, you can't just put in rules and frameworks. You need to motivate, you need to incentivize. So for those who may not be aware of it, the government actually agreed that where we actually have a grant of about US 1.4 million, where we try and defray expenses for those who are undertaking this green journey. Because usually the stumbling block is about how expensive it is, the cost of it, the cost of validating. So there's actually a grant out for that. That's another thing the regulators, that we have done. And we're also mindful that whilst you have all this in place, there needs to be a common language. So other than the CCPT that Bank Negara did, we also have the SRI taxonomy, and that's also meant to handhold. But if you recall my point earlier, investor protection was important. We recognize that disclosure needs to be done properly, quality, and consistent. And therefore, we actually also, I think, came up with guidelines on how does one manage ESG risk, the greenwashing that you mentioned, because that needs to be spelled out. And I think that's where we want to say that in advancing the sustainability agenda, we have looked at the entire continuum, the capital continuum, where we've taken into account issuers, investors. But I think I also want to just remind here, inclusiveness was always high in our agenda. So we have constantly looked at how MSMEs, the very key engine of the government, is taken care of. So earlier, I think it was last month, where we also came out with a guidance by an affiliate within SC for how MSMEs can take that journey. So in short, enable and facilitate.
Thanks, Haniza. I think that was quite a comprehensive view of what's been done, and it's wonderful to hear we've started back in 2014 and that transition actually made it a lot easier as well. Fiona, given the work that you've done with the World Bank to support governments in policy reforms and implementing frameworks to ensure ESG and sustainable finance alignment, what do you think is sort of interesting and unique about Malaysia's ESG disclosure and reporting requirements, and perhaps maybe you can expand a little bit more to give the comparative view of how Malaysia is performing versus others.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for the invitation. I should say there's always two reasons why I like coming to them, sort of involving with Malaysia. One is that talk to Malaysians if you want tips on where the best food is. Yes. So I've already got tips on the food trucks. Come to Malaysia. And then the second is on the innovation, exactly as you're saying. And I think it really is the case that you have been innovators in the financial markets, exactly as you're saying. And this panel shows you why. Two reasons. One, the regulator has a development mandate. And I think that's incredibly important, that you explicitly have that and you really use that. And the second is you have incredibly precious sources of long-term domestic capital. And you guys have been incredibly important in developing the local capital markets and the bond markets, and you've always been integral to that. So I think this innovation is incredibly important from Malaysia. So we talked a bit about, as you say, the instruments, the taxonomies, but I think you're also, Malaysia's been ahead of the curve on the reporting. And why this sustainable reporting? Why do we talk about this? Why is it getting a lot of attention around COP? But it's an incredibly important link between the financial sector and the real sector. So how you, as investors, can really drive change in the domestic, in the real economy. So the reporting is incredibly important, and your role, as we've seen in your capital market development role, is a very important one. So we're on to, I think it's the third iteration of the Bursa reporting requirements already. There's more, as you say, ESG coming. So you've very much been, again, this is an area where Malaysia's been ahead of the curve. And we've done quite a lot of benchmarking of what are listed companies reporting with ESG around the world. And we look at a set of basic indicators you'd expect across most countries to see. And we've benchmarked that for Thailand, we've done Cambodia, South Africa, Colombia, lots of countries. I think a couple of things to me really stand out for Malaysia actually is consistency. So you were saying structure. Structures actually I think is very good when it comes to reporting. Having this structure is very important. And there's a lot of consistency in the reporting by companies in Malaysia across sectors. So some countries you'll see really good reporting by the banks, but not so good by manufacturing. It's actually pretty much across the board actually with Malaysia. It's pretty consistent, which I think is very good. And if you look at the areas I think you really stand out when we look at the benchmarking we've done is on actually the sort of the governance and the strategy kind of side of the reporting by the companies is really good, actually. It's some of the best I've seen in any of the benchmarks. The area where I think is coming, and the top sort of 30, top 50 companies, very good results. I think is, again, very much on a global benchmark. The top firms are absolutely there and on a par with some of their global peers. It does come off, you mentioned the SMEs, it does come off quite quickly. That's what you see in other countries as well. But I think certainly the top layer of countries is very consistent and very strong, particularly on the governance side with the reporting in Malaysia. Where I think there is more coming and starting is exactly you're saying on transition, Faisal. So I think only about 10% of the companies that we looked at have a transition plan. But this is new. I mean, it's new for everywhere. So the Climate Disclosure Project, the CDP, they look at carbon footprinting for, I think it's about 19,000 companies around the world. Okay. Only 4,000 of them have a transition plan. And they have really interesting guidelines of what constitutes a robust, as you say, it's not just tick in the box. What's a robust transition plan? I think less than 100 actually tick all of those qualities. So the fact that you have about 10% of listed companies even starting to do transition plans, it's a really good basis, I think, to work forward going forward. So I think in summary, I like the consistency. I think you're really there on the governance, the transition starting, and I also really like the balance between quantitative and qualitative. I think you have a nice balance in the reporting in Malaysia. I know you come from a world of sort of GRI and double materiality. So again, the impact, not just the reporting, but what's the impact that the companies are having. That's a very strong point you have as well, I would say.
Wonderful. Thanks, Fiona, for sharing that. Just to sort of move across to sort of another slightly different topic, but we talked about the fact that there's a lot of opportunities in terms of green investments in Malaysia. Rick mentioned some sectors which PNB is particularly interested in. Haniza had mentioned, all the different policies which is put in place and frameworks which is put in place to really encourage greater investments. Perhaps, Datuk Faisal, you'd be able to share a little bit more. And Khazanah, who owns both Malaysian and foreign assets, and you get to see, and you're basically collaborating as well with many companies as well. Where do you see biggest opportunities that foreign investors may be interested in Malaysia to invest in as we move towards this growth of green acceleration that you had highlighted?
Thanks, Nolan. Actually, if you look at the full spectrum of capital, there's actually pretty exciting in all of them. Let's take public markets, for example. We just talked about, Fiona was talking about consistency of reporting. Yes. And coming out with transition plans. Yes. Now, I have to say that some of the listed companies that we have could have been hammered in terms of stock price because they didn't have those plans initially. And capital, because of compliance, basically sold those stock. So if we have a plan here, if companies do, like I said, be transparent in terms of transition, then those are actually real opportunities, right? Real opportunities from a public markets perspective, investing in transition, well, there's actually a value. Now, the other part of it is the private capital. Now, for private capital, I think this is also very interesting because what we are finding is when it comes to just money, availability of money, there's actually a lot of it. Yes. Okay. We've heard Rick as well, and all the funds locally, domestic funds, have the money. Okay. And as a foreign investor, we've seen some signings this morning. They also have the money as well. It's available. The problem here is trying to find the right opportunities. Yeah. So if you are a foreign investor, I would suggest that in order to look at this market in Malaysia, there must be an added value that you can offer. So even as a financial investor, the added value would be the financial engineering. If you can come in and perhaps, with experience of investing internationally, you can try to blend some capital perhaps and go for the riskier elements, use financial engineering, that would be actually pretty interesting. And there's a lot of opportunities there. The other thing is, even when you look at investments as far as FDI is concerned, right? I would say just follow the emissions. right, follow emissions of the country. I'm looking at 2018 numbers, half of the emissions in the country is from generation, power generation. Yeah. And there's a lot of opportunities there. And you've seen, like for us, within the Khazanah group, you have the power company looking at transition. You have Lestra, and they have a green investment platform. And as an example, partnering the likes of I Squared, through Blue Leaf Energy, partnering, I Squared, Hexa Renewables, and also Macquarie with Blue Leaf. So again, they're actually partnering people in order to look at some of these investments, right? So there's an opportunity, but the foreign capital, they need to know where to invest, and that's why a partnership with domestic actually helps. The other thing is FDIs, right? Foreign direct investments. And here, it'll be a great opportunity for the country, and in a way, geopolitics, it's something that we can't avoid. So people are looking at where do we invest apart from just China, and how do we actually de-risk that? Yeah. So Malaysia actually stands to gain from that. And if I look at the renewable space, for example, how shall I say this? And then I'll just say it anyway. Okay. I heard this phrase being said, everything green, goes through red, right? Goes through red, okay? Everything green. And that's because there's a tremendous amount of investment done, I think, in China before, where you have the wind turbines, solar, battery, right? There's a tremendous amount there. So why not we take this opportunity to actually have Malaysia to be able to be part of that as an investor? And that's because even solar, for example, we have a lot of solar manufacturing, but they're all for export. So here's an opportunity where, if in looking at renewable energy, there's an opportunity not just to play in just developing, but also the equipment as well, right? So manufacturing in some of the, whether it's solar panels, whether it's anything else. Now, there's other parts of investments which I think we should also be mindful of, because it's not just about energy transition. We're also looking at, and I'm using sustainability more generally. So if I look at ESG, for example, we can't forget the S, right? Social aspect of it. And here, Malaysia is a large exporter of agriculture. And we employ a lot of people. And some of the companies that we have, some of the exports, we couldn't export them, right? So there's still an opportunity here for, as a foreign investor who brings in technology. Now that's quite helpful, because brings in technology for making sure, for example, the soil nutrients, for example, are maintained, or automation and robotics in order to reduce the people in the plantations. And those are other opportunities as well. So, when you look at investments, do look at investments and follow the emissions and how we try to reduce it from power, from transportation, manufacturing and construction, right, as well as industry. And those are the things I would look at. Oh yeah, one other thing I think which is actually quite interesting, and this is what we are doing under the LESRA, is industrial parks, okay? So a lot of investment I talk about is about Malaysia, but another part where it actually helps the country gain competitiveness overseas is trying to convert our industrial parks to be powered by renewable energy. And by doing so, whether it's, we just signed the, Lesser just signed with Nor Power, this is on Kulim, for example, then it allows the participants in the park to be able to be competitive in their exports. So I would say, as far as foreign investors are concerned, a lot of opportunities, but don't just bring money. Bring in value, and then there's plenty, the doors will open.
And it's not just around looking at the traditional partnerships and collaborations. There's a lot of different opportunities across different parts of the value chain as well. So that's a great perspective. Haniza, perhaps you can give a view on the types of collaborations and partnerships which you feel will be most effective to support financing for Malaysia's green economy as well, from a regulatory perspective.
I think, Nolan, before I answer that question, it's probably important to realize when you want to see who would be relevant in this collaborative ecosystem, why or what's motivating that action.
Yeah.
And I think I do want to pick up on that investment opportunities answer, because what motivated how we came up with interventions, because those interventions determine who you're going to work with, right?
Yep.
So in a roundabout way, I'm trying to answer your question, because what motivated, I think, for at least for the capital market regulator was not only we had that common factor I mentioned just now between Islamic finance and sustainability, but we also saw the funding gap that needed to be addressed. And hence, that gave investment opportunities. And by recognizing that and the fact that we are also trying to be inclusive in how we come up with our interventions, that meant that we needed to be inclusive in how we view it. Not all investors are like that comes under the flagship of Khazanah and PNB. We have got a wide spectrum of it. So when you look at our collaborations, it would depend on what we are going to be doing. Since the outcomes or the investment opportunities must be able to address the needs on the sustainability journey of the big corporates, the small companies, the MSMEs, and those in the real economy. So our solutions then came up with SRI Sukuk, which are big tickets, and then you have your equity crowdfunding and P2P, which might have the flavor of sustainability in a smaller space, and we recognize this public and private market, and so you see a lot of our guidances work towards that. I mean, we've worked with parties, and I pick up on the word innovation. So that's why I say my answer to you comes in different parts. Yep. Collaboration can come out either in the form of thought leadership, yes, or come out in actual outcomes. We've worked with World Bank for the solar project. We've worked with universities and the likes of, renowned think tanks in coming up with ideation so that we can work it into creating or ideating a framework. So the private-public partnership comes in different forms. So I'm hoping that what I'm trying to put across is that as a regulator, our end game is that, our current strategic planning is that we need to move towards planning for a stakeholder economy. Everyone's included in that space. Hence why it cuts across the spectrum.
I understand. So an inclusive model, right, that has multiple different forms of partnerships and collaborations which are available not just from a large organization perspective, but across the range as well. Very clear. Rick, from the investor's perspective, how can investors ensure that their investment portfolio companies, I mean, you touched upon this already, but how can we ensure that our companies under our portfolio are resilient against headwinds and tailwinds? What are some of the different things that you and your team have been thinking about to support your portfolio companies as well?
So fundamentally, it's about understanding the risk and addressing the risk. So I'll talk a bit about it in two parts. One is what are we doing with our existing portfolio, and what are we doing, I guess, with new investments that we're making. And I think the first point is something that Dato' Faisal mentioned is that you follow the emissions. And what it means is you need to really baseline your emissions firstly. So we spend quite a bit of time creating a robust baseline. So for PNB, our emissions is like 12 million tons. 99% of that is finance emissions. And we've covered 85% of the portfolio, which is a very high portfolio coverage ratio. And what we found was 90% of the emissions is domestic. 80+% of the emissions are in 3 sectors, so utilities, palm oil, and oil and gas. And 10 companies account for 90% of emissions, and in particular, 2 companies are 70%. So when you follow the emissions, you now have a clear view of what are the places I need to tackle to make my portfolio resilient and robust. Second thing you need to do is engage and engage and engage. And what this means is communicating your expectations to investors. So we wrote shareholder letters to all the companies that we own. We then revised our voting guidelines so that by Jan 1st, 2025, if our companies don't have a net zero ambition, we will vote no to chairman appointment or the chair of the sustainability committee appointment when they come for re-election. By Jan 1st, 2026, if they don't have a credible plan we will do the same thing. So we communicate expectation, we ratchet up, I guess, the expectations by through votes. The other thing that we're doing right now, and to be honest, we are starting this journey, so we're not by no means far in advance or completed. We now are trying to get clarity to what Fiona said. Is there a credible plan that these companies have announced? And for us, when we think about how do we assess a company's plan to make it, is it credible or not, we took, assessment from NZIF, Net Zero Investment Framework, and a bit of the Climate Action 100. And ultimately, what we're looking for is, do these companies have the stated ambition to be net zero? Do they have short and medium-term targets? Do they disclose these targets? Do they disclose progress? Do they disclose how capital is allocated to kind of hit these targets? And we've started to assess all these companies to say, are they, net zero aligned, on a path to be net zero aligned, or so on. And our engagement will then be customized to that. So ultimately, it's a journey, especially for companies that we currently own. And as I said, three companies, or two companies in particular, are very, very important to get us on this path to having a resilient portfolio. And not only that, if we get these two companies right, I think Malaysia will go a long way. Second point, as I mentioned, is around new money that we want to invest. So how do we, we need to tackle current portfolio and also new money. Yeah. So new money, what we're doing is we now have every investment paper that goes to the investment committee, we are clear what is the carbon impact of us making that investment. So we make the investment, does it increase our average? Our average is about 47 ringgit per $1 million, 47 tons per $1 million ringgit of investment. So there are sectors that are very high and very low, but we take a de-average view. So where it is high, it increases the average. We'll have conversations around, are we confident that over the next few years that plan or that company has what it takes to reduce it? If not, we might not make the investment. We are now thinking about, do we start putting in carbon pricing into investment decisions? Do we do carbon budgeting? Those are a bit more rigorous steps, but as I said, we are starting this journey, and we will start doing those things. So it is a fairly involved process for us to move this portfolio. It is a 330 billion ringgit portfolio, 80% domestic, and the 10 companies that we invest in is not easy because, for example, the utility, and I think Faisal, you mentioned earlier, utility, to force them to decarbonize is not just a shareholder matter, it's actually a national matter, because if you do that too early, prices, the affordability of electricity and security of supply are at stake. But what we want to have is the conversation amongst the institutional shareholders and also with the regulator to try to make it happen, because we believe it's important to at least have the conversation and have a pathway to get it done. And as I said earlier, we are willing to invest behind some of these initiatives that our companies are doing to decarbonize.
Thanks, Rick. I mean, it's really impressive to understand, to have a clear perspective of the ESG view of your company portfolio as a whole, but also have a clear plan of, what needs to be done to address that. Fiona, I think just taking a step back, we've talked a lot about Malaysia, we talked a lot about the investment opportunities and how we think about that. Maybe you can give a view from a global perspective on, where do you see the importance of ESG-aligned sustainable finance going globally, in the region, across Asia, and perhaps in Southeast Asia? What are the key things that we need to sort of be aware of as we move forward?
So just to wrap up very quickly, I would just say, and by the way, not all fund managers can do that. Not everyone can do that and can say as clearly as you've just done, this is our emissions, this is where they come from. Don't underestimate that. Not all fund managers can do that. So again, the fact that you're looking at that in Malaysia and the fact that the biggest fund managers are doing this is incredibly important. And your reporting actually from as investors, as well as the listed companies, your reporting is very good too. And I think something that we can benchmark and we should showcase to other countries more. Global trends. So I think we're at a really, really important point. We've gone from having, and again, you guys were leaders, there's now so much out there in terms of ESG regulations, guidance. The UN Principles of Responsible Investment, they have this fantastic database of regulation. And if you look at the chart, it went like this. For the last few years, it's gone like this. It's exponential. They've now got like 800 pieces on there. And in 2022, they had 225 new pieces of guidance and regulation, twice as many as any other year. So it's really gone like this. And most of it was voluntary. We're now tipping into mandatory. We're tipping into a point where we're going into regulation from just guidance. And therefore, getting this consistency right is incredibly important. Otherwise, I think we're going to lose people. And they're going to say, what's a proper regulation? What's a transition plan? How do we believe any of this? But I'm going to go back to issuing vanilla bonds. I'm not going to do this because how do we believe any of this? So we've got a real opportunity, but it's a really important point, I think, to get this right. 3 things I would say for the next steps sort of for Malaysia. One is to build off the really good stuff that you have, but think about consistency with the international standards, you know, the ISSB and stuff that's coming. Don't lose the good stuff you have, but how do you get some more consistency with some of these international structures, I think, coming? 2, I think within the country, as you say, you've had a lot of initiatives, several of the taxonomies, things even within the stock exchange, things like the FTSE for Good. You guys ask companies, you have your own list of questions you ask companies. How do you make sure you can make that as easy as possible for the listed companies? So, for example, there have been some initiatives like in Singapore where they can report into one place. So the data's all in one place and one platform. Particularly for smaller companies, it makes it easier for them. So that some of that sort of consistency then, I think, domestically, and then how you align with the international frameworks. You're pretty well aligned already, but getting that in line as well, I think will really help with this tipping point and moving into consistent mandatory regulation globally.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you so much. So I think we're out of time. So just very briefly, I think it's been a wonderful panel session with some really interesting insight. You know, there's a lot that's happening in Malaysia, a lot of opportunities. You know, there is capital, but it's around, you know, what are the right types of collaborations, partnerships that we can put in place across the range that would be important to be able to drive this forward. Rick had mentioned the fact that, you know, our fund managers are actually doing a lot to really actively shape and ensure this shift towards sustainable and ESG compliant investing as well. And Fiona had mentioned, you know, we've done a lot and Malaysia's doing well, but still a little bit more way to go to ensure that, you know, everyone is involved and we have a lot of structure in place as well. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much to our panel today for all your time. Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator and speaker for the comprehensive and insightful session. I would like to ask our speaker and moderator to just stay back for our photography sessions. Smile at our professional photographer at front. All right, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to our moderators and speakers. Thank you so much. Thank you again for that session. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can stay tuned because next session